Hey friends, sometimes life takes us through seasons that feel like opposite worlds. One moment you're surrounded by comfort, by the ease that wealth and stability bring, and then suddenly, it's all gone. You find yourself standing in the same city, under the same sky, but the world around you feels cold and strange. The lady in this story knew that feeling all too well. Once, she was a woman of means, known for her grace and refinement. Her hands were used to giving her home a place of light and culture. Yet, within just 4 short years, the wind shifted and everything changed. The wealth that once surrounded her faded like a mist, leaving her face to face with poverty, real, pressing, humbling poverty. But here's the beautiful thing, her heart didn't change. Even in her lack, she remained as generous as when she had plenty. You see, that's one of the quiet secrets of faith. Real faith doesn't depend on our situation. It depends on the God who never changes. So, there she was, now living with her daughter in very modest circumstances, with barely enough to eat. Yet when she heard about another woman in distress, a poor soul who needed to travel to a neighboring state where a job awaited her, she didn't hesitate. She didn't say, "I'll help when things get better." She didn't say, "Let me wait until next month." Instead, she opened her small purse, counted the little that remained, just $1.50, and said, "I'll help you go." Think about that for a moment. She was giving away the last money she had, not knowing what she herself would eat by evening. But her heart was so tuned to kindness, so surrendered to God's leading, that she didn't even let logic talk her out of love. It reminds me of that widow Jesus watched in the temple, the one who dropped in her 2 little copper coins. Everyone else gave out of their abundance, but she gave out of her lack. And Jesus said she gave more than them all. Why? Because she gave her heart, her trust, and her faith with that offering. This lady's story was much like that. With her last $1.50, she bought her struggling friend a ferry ticket across to Jersey City and even saw her safely to the train. She stayed beside her until she boarded, probably encouraging her with gentle words and maybe a quiet prayer. And when the train pulled away, she turned back toward the ferry, thinking she had a few coins left, just 10 cents, to get herself home. But when she reached for her purse, her heart sank. The 10 cents she thought she had was gone. Then she remembered. She had used it that morning to buy a quart of milk, the only breakfast she and her daughter had. Now picture her there, alone at the edge of the ferry dock, the evening setting in, the noise of travelers fading around her. She's standing between 2 worlds, one where she once had more than enough, and one where even 10 cents was a mountain. She had nothing, not even the fare to cross back home. So she did the only thing she could. She took off the simple gold ring from her finger, one of the few pieces left from better days, and offered it to the ferry master. She explained her situation and told him she would redeem it tomorrow. But the man shook his head and refused. Maybe he'd been disappointed too many times before, or maybe he just didn't understand her faith. But either way, she was left there, helpless. At that moment, she could have broken down in tears, cursed her misfortune, or blamed God for allowing her fall from comfort to humiliation. But instead, she quietly went into the ladies' waiting room, sat down, and began to pray. Can you imagine that? She didn't reach for a phone or look for a stranger to plead with. She simply turned to her greatest resource, the Lord Himself. And in that quiet space, with her head probably bowed and her heart trembling, she poured out her soul. She said something like, "Father, you've always taken care of me. You know I've done what I could with what I had. I don't understand why I'm here, but please, help me. I need you." Oh, my friend, there's a kind of prayer that heaven cannot ignore. It's not eloquent or long, but it's full of trust. It's the kind of prayer that says, "Lord, I have no one else." And that's when miracles happen. Just as she finished praying, a young girl came rushing past her, bumping her arm and knocking her parasol to the floor. She bent down to pick it up, turned it upside down, and out rolled a small coin. A nickel. Just 5 cents. Now, 5 cents doesn't sound like much today. But in that moment, it was everything. It was grace in coin form. It was God's whisper saying, "I see you. I haven't forgotten you." Her heart must have leapt as she picked up that coin, tears filling her eyes. That small nickel was enough to get her across the ferry, and enough to remind her that heaven's supply never runs dry. She didn't just find money. She found proof that God listens, even to the smallest prayers. You see, this story isn't really about a nickel. It's about divine attention. It's about how God stoops low enough to meet us in the smallest corners of our need. He doesn't just part the seas or rain down manna. Sometimes, He lets a coin roll out of a parasol. That moment tells us something profound. If God could hear the cry of a woman who needed just 5 cents, don't you think He hears you when you're asking for rent money, tuition, peace, or healing? He does. Every sigh, every whisper, every quiet tear that falls when no one's looking, it all reaches His heart. So, my dear friend, the next time you feel like your faith is too small, or your prayer too insignificant, remember this woman. Remember how she once had wealth, but what really made her rich was her faith. Even when stripped of everything else, she still had trust. And that trust was enough for heaven to act. Sometimes God allows the loss of our earthly security to reveal the beauty of His divine sufficiency. She lost her fortune but found faith that could never be taken from her. As she stepped onto that ferry, holding that 5-cent coin tightly in her hand, I imagined her heart swelling with gratitude. The night air was cool, maybe the sky painted with the last blush of the setting sun. The city lights flickered over the water like golden promises. Every ripple beneath the ferry seemed to whisper to her, "You are not alone." That ride home wasn't just a short journey across the river. It was a sacred passage from fear to faith. She had seen God's hand move in the tiniest detail, and that reminder would anchor her through every future storm. I can almost see her sitting quietly on the ferry bench, tears welling up in her eyes, whispering over and over, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you." It's moments like that which remind us that our Heavenly Father isn't distant. He's close, so close that He sees the smallest tremor in our hearts. He knows when you're standing on the edge of despair and when your last cent is gone. And just as He provided for that lady, He still provides today, not always in dramatic, earth-shaking ways, but often in gentle, personal ones. It might be through a friend who suddenly calls at the right moment, or a stranger who offers help, or even a thought of peace that settles your stormy heart. God's hand often hides inside ordinary moments. When I think of that woman's story, I can't help but picture her walking back to her little home that night. Maybe her daughter had been waiting, wondering why she was late. Maybe the small room they lived in was dimly lit, simple, but warm. And when her mother stepped in and told her what happened, that God had literally provided 5 cents through the fall of a parasol. I imagine they both laughed through tears. That moment must have felt like heaven brushing against earth. The kind of joy that doesn't come from riches, but from realizing that the maker of the universe just stooped low to answer your prayer. Friend, I want you to hold on to this truth. Sometimes, God doesn't remove the struggle because He wants to reveal Himself through it. If that lady had still been rich, she would never have known the sweetness of finding grace in a nickel. She would never have seen how personal God can be, how near, how thoughtful. It reminds me of when Israel wandered in the wilderness. Every morning, they woke up to fresh manna, not a storehouse full, not a week's supply, but just enough for that day. It wasn't about the bread itself, it was about trust. God was teaching them to depend on Him daily, not occasionally. That's exactly what this woman learned. When she had much, she gave from her abundance. But when she had little, she gave from her trust. And when she gave from her trust, she met the God who multiplies faith into provision. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe there's been a time when your purse felt empty, when you looked at your situation and thought, "How will I make it through?" Maybe it wasn't money. Maybe it was strength, or peace, or hope. But here's the wonder of God's love. He meets us not only in our abundance but especially in our emptiness. It's when we've come to the end of ourselves that we begin to see the start of Him. The woman could have let pride keep her silent, but she chose prayer over pride. That's a big lesson right there. Many people suffer in silence because they don't want to admit their need. But prayer is not a sign of weakness. It's the ultimate declaration of trust. It's saying, Lord, I can't, but I know you can. And every time someone prays that way, heaven moves. I often think of how many people today would have missed that moment. Some would have blamed themselves, some would have panicked, and some would have simply given up. But this lady didn't. She turned her worry into worship and her despair into dependence. Maybe, friend, that's what God is asking you to do today. To take your situation, whatever it looks like, and say, Lord, I'm done worrying. I'm done fretting. I'm going to trust you right here, in this little waiting room of life. Because the truth is, faith isn't faith when everything's easy. Faith becomes real when everything's uncertain. There's something so beautiful about people who still give, even when they have nothing left. You can almost hear heaven whispering over them, "That's my child." And that's exactly what this woman was, a child of faith. She didn't let her fall from wealth destroy her kindness or her courage. Instead, her trials became her testimony. You know, it's easy to serve God when everything is shining, when there's food on the table, money in the bank, and smiles all around. But when the table is bare and your purse is empty, yet you still choose to pray, still choose to believe, still choose to be kind, that's when faith becomes radiant. That's when you look like Christ. I think of how Jesus himself had no place to lay his head, yet he fed others. He healed, he gave, he loved, even when he had nothing of material comfort. And when we, like this woman, act from that same spirit, we step into divine likeness. Now imagine this. The next morning, perhaps that same lady got up, tired but at peace, ready to keep trusting God. Maybe she didn't know where the next meal would come from, but something inside her had changed. Her fear had been replaced with confidence, not confidence in herself, but in the one who never fails. And isn't that what we all need? That quiet assurance that says, my life is in bigger hands than mine. So, my friend, as you listen to this story, I want you to picture your own journey. Maybe you've lost something, wealth, status, health, or people. Maybe you've gone from abundance to emptiness. But if there's one thing this story reminds us, it's that loss can never separate us from love, the love of God that still provides, still guides, and still answers prayer. It's easy to see this as just an old story from another time, but I believe it's timeless. Because somewhere today, there's another woman praying for her next meal. Somewhere, there's a man wondering how to pay the bills. Somewhere, there's a family choosing between hope and despair. And to every one of them, this story still speaks. God sees. God knows. God provides. The same God who placed that coin in a fallen parasol is still working miracles in hidden ways. You may not see it yet, but is already moving things around on your behalf. Sometimes, all he needs is your faith, the kind that looks up and says, Lord, I know you're still here. So, when you find yourself on the edge, when the last cent is gone and the way forward looks closed, don't panic. Pray. Trust. Wait. Because somewhere, somehow, a nickel is about to roll your way. And when it does, it won't just be money, it'll be mercy. It won't just be provision, it'll be proof that your Father never forgets his children. As the woman sat in her little room that night, I imagined her holding that nickel, staring at it in the dim glow of her lamp, her eyes glistening not because of the coin's value, but because of what it represented. That small piece of metal was proof that heaven had heard her whisper. It wasn't just a coin, it was a message, I see you. And isn't that what every believer longs to hear deep down? We just want to know that we are not invisible to God. When we cry, someone listens. That when our hearts ache, someone notices. That's what this story brings to life, the faithfulness of a God who bends low enough to meet us where we are. Sometimes people think miracles are only about big, dramatic moments, blind eyes opening, seas parting, thunderous voices from heaven. But in truth, some of the most precious miracles are quiet. They happen in kitchens, in tiny rooms, in moments when no one else is watching. A lost coin was found. A bill unexpectedly paid. A word of comfort when your heart feels broken. This woman didn't get a bag of gold or a house full of bread. She got 5 cents. And yet, that was enough to light up her soul. Because in that 5 cents, she found something money could never buy, assurance that God was still walking with her. I think about how many times we overlook the small miracles in our own lives. We pray for big breakthroughs and miss the daily mercies, the breath in our lungs, the friend who checks in at the right moment, the food on our table, the peace that makes no sense. These are the quiet gifts that whisper, "I'm still with you." And when you start to notice those, your heart becomes a fountain of gratitude. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start saying, "Thank you, Lord, even here." This woman's story also carries a challenge, one we often avoid. It's about generosity when you yourself are in need. Think about it. She gave her last $1.50 to help someone else. Her last. That's not just generosity, that's trust in motion. She didn't wait to be comfortable before giving. She gave from her discomfort. And that's where real giving begins. Anyone can give from plenty. But heaven takes special note when you give from sacrifice. It reminds me of that widow in the Bible who gave her 2 mites, everything she had. And Jesus said she gave more than all the rich men combined. Not because of the amount, but because of the heart behind it. I can almost hear heaven applauding this woman too. Every step she took toward that ferry was a step of faith. And even though she momentarily found herself without a way back, God had already arranged her miracle. He just needed her to walk far enough to see it. You see, sometimes God allows us to walk to the edge so that when He shows up, there's no doubt about who made the way. If she had found the nickel earlier, she might have brushed it off as luck. But after she prayed, after she surrendered, after she reached the end of her own strength, then came the miracle. That's often how God works. He lets us come to the end of our rope, not to make us fall, but to make us reach. Because faith doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in surrender. And maybe that's what He's doing in your life right now. Maybe you're wondering why things feel so uncertain, so tight, so stretched. Maybe it's because God is writing a story, one where His faithfulness will shine brighter than your fear. The woman probably didn't see herself as the main character of a testimony. She just wanted to go home. But her little story, told in a corner of the world, became a beacon of faith to thousands later. That's what God does. He turns small moments of trust into great legacies of faith. So don't underestimate the power of your own story. You might think your struggles are insignificant, but someone else will see your endurance and find the courage to keep going. I imagine, years later, that woman still telling that story to her daughter, maybe sitting by the window, remembering that ferry ride, smiling as she says, "Never forget, my dear, God cares," about the smallest details. And maybe her daughter grew up carrying that same kind of faith, the kind that knows prayer changes everything, even when all you need is 5 cents. Faith is like that, it's contagious. When you truly live it, people around you can't help but feel it. It seeps into your words, your actions, your attitude. That's why stories like this are so powerful. They pass on courage like a flame. There's a gentle lesson here too about humility. This lady didn't think herself too refined to cry out for help. Remember, she was once wealthy, used to comfort, used to the best of things. But when her circumstances changed, she didn't grow bitter or proud, she grew closer to God. And that's one of the hardest transformations for a human heart, to go from wealth to poverty, and still worship. Yet, this woman showed us how to do it, with open hands, not clenched fists. The world might see her as poor, but heaven saw her as rich, rich in faith, rich in love, rich in trust. And you know, sometimes, God allows the stripping away of material comfort to clothe us in something far greater, dependence. Because as long as we think we can manage life on our own, we'll never taste the depth of His sufficiency. But when everything is gone, the comfort, the stability, the control, and all that's left is faith, that's when you begin to experience the God who truly satisfies. There's something about people who've walked through lack and still love God. Their voices carry weight. Their prayers sound different. Their gratitude runs deeper, because they've seen firsthand what it means to have nothing but still have everything in Him. Maybe that's why stories like this still touch hearts today, because we all know what it feels like to reach the end of our resources. But we also know that feeling of divine rescue, that quiet assurance that says, God came through again. So if you're listening to this and you've been wondering whether God still sees you, yes, He does. even if it's about something as small as 5 cents, even if it's something you think isn't big enough to pray about. If it matters to you, it matters to Him. The same God who provided for that woman on a ferry still reigns today. He hasn't lost His power, His tenderness, or His attention to detail. And when He shows up, it might not look like what you expect, but it will always be right on time. Imagine the moment she held that nickel in her hand, trembling fingers, tear-streaked face, but a heart bursting with awe. That tiny coin was more than metal. It was mercy made visible. It was heaven saying, "You're not forgotten." And I want you to picture her walking out of that ferry house, clutching the nickel like treasure, whispering words of gratitude only heaven could hear. Her steps must have felt lighter, her spirit lifted. You could almost sense a smile breaking through her weariness. That kind of smile that comes when you realize the Lord of the universe just answered a prayer meant only for His ears. There's something profoundly beautiful about moments like this, where God meets us not in thunder, but in tenderness, where the miracle isn't loud, but quiet enough to reach the deepest corners of the soul. You see, sometimes we think God is only near when He does something big. But this story whispers another truth. God is closest in the smallest details. He's there in the coin that rolls out of a parasol. He's there with a friend who calls at the right time. He's there in the meal that somehow stretches further than it should. He's not a distant king. He's a present Father. And that's why this story touches the heart so deeply. Because it reminds us that divine love stoops low. It meets us on ferry decks, in borrowed rooms, in weary sighs. I imagine this woman returning home that evening, her faith glowing stronger than ever. She might have looked around at her little house, bare walls, simple furniture, and yet, everything must have felt sacred, because she'd seen proof that God still provides. Maybe she told her daughter, "We prayed this morning for strength, and God gave us this." And that child, wide-eyed and listening, learned a truth that would stay with her for a lifetime, that prayer works, and that no situation is too small for God's care. You never know who's watching your faith, do you? Sometimes the people around us, our children, friends, or even strangers, are being strengthened quietly by how we respond to need. That's why this story carries more than just a message about provision. It's about the legacy of faith. When you choose to trust God in scarcity, you're not only changing your own story, you're shaping someone else's too. And I think this is what makes George Müller's records so timeless. They don't just speak about miracles. They show what trusting God looks like in everyday life. This woman's fall from wealth to poverty could have made her bitter. But instead, she became more generous, more prayerful, more reliant on God. She didn't lose her faith when she lost her money. She found it. That's the beauty of a faith that's been tested. It becomes unbreakable. Because once you've seen God provide when you have nothing, you'll never doubt His goodness again. And maybe that's why God sometimes allows us to pass through lack, not to punish us, but to purify us, to strip away every false comfort until all we have left is Him, and then to show us that He's more than enough. Let's be honest, the world measures wealth by what's in your hand, but heaven measures it by what's in your heart. This woman gave away her last dollar to help another soul, and in doing so, she opened the door for her own miracle. That's the rhythm of the kingdom. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Pressed down, shaken together, and running over. When we hold tightly to what we have, fear wins. But when we open our hands, even when they're almost empty, faith wins. And when faith wins, miracles follow. I love how God works like that, quietly, creatively, perfectly timed. He could have sent someone to pay her fare. He could have placed the 10 cents back in her purse. But instead, He chose a nickel in a parasol, so unusual that she'd never forget it. Because sometimes the miracle isn't about the provision itself. It's about the memory it leaves behind. The kind that keeps your faith alive in darker seasons. Maybe you've had a nickel in the parasol. Moment 2, that one small thing that reminded you. God was still with you. Maybe it was a message that came right when you were breaking down. Or a job that opened up just in time. Or strength that appeared when you thought you had none left. Hold on to those moments. They are your reminders, your little stones of remembrance, that God still moves, still hears, still cares. And if you haven't had one yet, don't lose heart. Because God hasn't forgotten your street, your prayer, or your need. Sometimes He waits, not to withhold, but to build trust. Because the longer you wait, the sweeter it feels when the answer comes. This woman's story may seem simple, but it carries a message big enough to carry us all. Faith never fails when its object is God. She started her day with nothing but obedience and ended it with a miracle. That's the journey of every believer who learns to walk by faith, step by step, sometimes trembling, sometimes unsure, but always trusting that God's hand is guiding the way. And at the end of it all, when you look back, you'll see it clearly. Every delay, every closed door, every tear, they were all part of the story that led you to your miracle. You know, when I think of that woman and her 5-cent miracle, I can't help but wonder how she must have felt walking home that night. The streetlights flickering, the wind brushing her face, her heart still pounding with gratitude. Every step she took must have echoed with one simple truth: God is still faithful. And maybe as she crossed back into her small neighborhood, her spirit whispered, if God can care about 5 cents, then surely He can care about everything else I need. That's the kind of revelation that changes how you see life. It's not about the amount, it's about the assurance. You begin to live differently when you know heaven is invested in your every step. The world might have looked at her and seen a woman who had lost everything: her fortune, her comfort, her security. But heaven looked at her and saw a woman gaining something far greater: unshakable trust. You see, wealth can teach you comfort, but poverty can teach you dependence. And dependence on God is the purest kind of wealth. I picture her entering her small home. Her daughter may be sitting by a dim lamp, waiting, hungry, but hopeful. And when the mother walked in, perhaps she smiled, not because she suddenly had plenty, but because she carried proof that her prayers had reached God's ears. She might have held her daughter close and said, "Darling, do you see what just happened? God has given us enough for today. He hasn't forgotten us." And isn't that the message we all need sometimes? That even when the cupboards are empty and the heart is tired, God still has a plan. His provision may not come in the way we expect, but it always comes in the way we need. So many times in life, we measure God's faithfulness by abundance, by how much we can see. But the deeper truth is that faith is often proven in the absence of plenty. When everything seems lost and yet your heart says, "Still, I will trust Him," that's where faith becomes real. That's where heaven draws close. I imagine this woman sitting later that night, reflecting on all that had happened. She had helped someone in need, using her last bit of money. That kind of generosity doesn't come from comfort. It comes from conviction, from knowing that everything you have belongs to God anyway. And maybe that's why God stepped in so quickly, because He delights in hearts that mirror His own. Hearts that give, even when it costs them something. That's the beauty of faith. It's contagious. It doesn't just lift you up. It inspires everyone who watches you to believe again. When she told that story later, perhaps to her daughter, perhaps to a neighbor, I can imagine the look on their faces. Astonishment, wonder, maybe even tears. Because stories like that awaken hope in weary hearts. They whisper, if God could do it for her, He can do it for me too. And that's exactly what faith does. It turns one person's private miracle into another person's public encouragement. I can see her years later, maybe still living simply, maybe still facing challenges, but never again doubting that her Heavenly Father sees her. Because once you've seen God move like that, your view of Him changes forever. You begin to walk with quiet confidence, not arrogance, but peace, because you've tasted His faithfulness, and it's sweeter than gold. And I think about how that moment, that tiny 5-cent miracle, must have echoed across heaven. Maybe angels smiled, watching how the Lord turned a desperate prayer into a story that would inspire generations. And now, here we are, more than a century later, still telling her story, still feeling the warmth of her faith. That's the power of a life that trusts God in hardship. It leaves a legacy that outlives the person. So if you're listening to this right now and you're in your own season of need, maybe not financial, maybe emotional, spiritual, or just weary of waiting, let this story remind you that God's eyes are on you. He hasn't missed a single sigh, a single prayer, a single tear. The same God who placed that nickel in her parasol is the same. God who knows how to send you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Maybe not in the way you expect, maybe not through who you expect, but always, always on time. You see, when the Lord provides, it's never late. He may not show up on your schedule, but is never absent from your story. Sometimes, He waits until every human option is gone, not because He wants to see you suffer, but because He wants to make sure that when the miracle comes, there's no doubt who deserves the glory. And that's what this woman's story teaches so beautifully, that trusting God isn't about having everything figured out. It's about resting in the one who does. I love how tenderly God writes these moments into our lives, little scenes of grace that reveal His care in ways only we could understand. Because for her, it wasn't just about money, it was about faith. For you, it might not be about bills or coins, it might be about healing, direction, or peace. But the message remains the same. God provides. Sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways, but always in faithful ways. And when He does, it's not just to meet a need, it's to remind you that you're never alone. So picture that woman, again, walking home that evening, with that 5-cent coin in her hand. To anyone else, it was just a nickel. But to her, it was a miracle. It was like holding a piece of heaven in her palm. Every time it glimmered in the fading light, it seemed to whisper, "See? I haven't forgotten you." And that's the thing about God's faithfulness. It's rarely loud, but it's always sure. It doesn't always arrive wrapped in thunder or light. Sometimes, it's a quiet, small provision that stops you in your tracks and reminds you that the Lord is nearer than your breath. You know, I imagine her walking through the ferry gates, clutching that little coin, her eyes lifting up to the sky, whispering, "Thank you, Lord. You really do see me." And somewhere in heaven, I'm certain the angel smiled, because another soul had learned the language of trust. That 5-cent miracle wasn't just about meeting her immediate need. It was about teaching her that divine help doesn't always come in large sums. Sometimes, it comes in small signs that say, "You're not forgotten." And haven't we all been there? Those moments when you're stretched thin, and you whisper a prayer that feels too small, almost silly, and yet God answers it, not because it's big, but because it's honest. Sometimes He waits until the very last moment, until the night feels longest, and the road feels empty, just so the breakthrough hits deeper. Because when you've prayed all night, when you've cried all your tears, and then you see God show up, it changes you. It leaves a mark that no sermon, no book, no preacher can ever replace. It's personal. And that's what I love about these George Müller stories. They aren't distant miracles. They are personal. They're raw, ordinary, human moments that suddenly turn sacred. They tell us that faith isn't reserved for saints and heroes, it's for struggling mothers, widows, workers, and anyone who dares to whisper, "Lord, help me." Can you imagine what her daughter must have felt that night when she saw her mother return home, smiling through tears? Maybe she asked, "Mama, did God help you?" And the mother, still trembling from the wonder of it all, probably held that coin out and said, "Yes, darling. Look, this is what God sent." And I can almost see the little girl's eyes widen, because for her too, that moment would never be forgotten. Children remember when God answers prayers. They remember the tone of faith in their parents' voices, the tears of gratitude, the unexpected miracles that shape their understanding of who God is. That one act of faith, that one answered prayer, could have changed that little girl's faith forever. And you know, that's how legacy begins. Not always through wealth, but through witness. Through lived faith, the kind that breathes in dark times and still says, "He's able." We often think of miracles as grand events, seas parting, the blind seeing, manna falling from the sky. But sometimes, God's greatest miracles are tucked into the quiet corners of our lives. A coin found in a parasol. A ring was discovered on a street. A kind word at the right moment. Those small mercies are the brushstrokes of divine love on the canvas of our struggles. And when we take the time to notice them, to whisper thank you, our hearts start to transform. Gratitude turns into strength. Strength turns into hope. And hope, that bright, steady light, keeps us walking forward, even when we don't know what tomorrow holds. You know, this story reminds me of a simple truth we often forget. God doesn't just provide for our needs. He provides for our faith. He gives us these small proofs of His presence, not because He owes us anything, but because He delights in being close to His children. He's not some distant deity watching from afar. He's a Father who listens when you sigh, who moves when you call, and who answers in ways that make you know, without a shadow of doubt, that was Him. So maybe tonight, or today, wherever you are, you need to hear this. God is not too big for your small prayer. He's not too busy for your small needs. If He could place a coin in a parasol in answer to a poor woman's whispered prayer, He can make a way for you too. Maybe your 5-cent miracle is on its way, that unexpected phone call, that open door, that gentle provision that comes right when you're about to give up. Hold on, because He's never late. He's just waiting for the perfect moment to remind you that. He still writes the best stories. And sometimes, all He asks is that we trust Him enough to give, even when it costs us something. Because generosity and faith always walk hand in hand. When we give what little we have, time, love, prayer, kindness, it may feel small, but in God's hands, it multiplies. Just like that woman's last $1.50 opened the door for another person's breakthrough, and in turn, God sent her own miracle right back. That's divine reciprocity. Heaven's mathematics, where giving doesn't reduce, it multiplies. And maybe that's what God is still teaching us today, that the road from wealth to poverty isn't always a curse. Sometimes it's a calling, a way for God to rewrite your dependence, refine your faith, and reintroduce Himself not as a concept, but as a constant. So whether you're in abundance or in need, keep your heart generous. Because when your hands are open to give, they're also open to receive. You see, this story of from wealth to poverty isn't just about losing or gaining money, it's about rediscovering God in every season of life. We often think of divine provision as something we must earn, as if we have to pray long enough or behave perfectly before God notices us. But stories like this gently remind us that His provision flows from love, not performance. God saw a once wealthy woman now walking with nothing but faith in her heart. And He smiled, because He knew she still trusted Him. Even when her pockets were empty, her faith was full. And that faith drew heaven's attention. That's what I want you to remember today. Heaven still responds to faith. Not fear, not perfection, not titles or status, just faith. And faith isn't measured by the size of your resources. It's measured by the depth of your trust. That's why the smallest prayers, whispered in the darkest nights, often echo the loudest in God's heart, because they come from a place of surrender. This woman had fallen from luxury to lack, but not from grace. Her ring might have been plain, her meal simple, her resources few, but her heart was still rich with something greater than gold. Trust. And that's what God honored. So if you're listening right now, and you've been through your own kind of loss, maybe not financial, but emotional, spiritual, or relational, hear this. God has not abandoned you. Even if life feels stripped bare, even if you're down to your last 10 cents, He still knows how to meet you right where you are. Sometimes He'll test your willingness to give, not to take something away, but to prove that His supply never runs out. That woman gave her last bit of money to help another, and God gave her a miracle that not only met her need but grew her faith. And I love how it happened. It wasn't through a stranger handing her a bag of gold or a sudden inheritance. It was through something so ordinary, a coin falling from her own parasol. You see, God often hides the miraculous in the ordinary. We expect thunder. He answers in whispers. We look for angels. He uses a jostling passerby. He's the God of the subtle, the God who speaks through timing, coincidences, and gentle interruptions. That's how faith matures, by learning to see His hand in the details. And if you've ever had one of those moments when something small happened at just the right time, that was God, too. So don't despise small beginnings. Don't overlook small mercies, because those are the bricks of faith that build testimonies like this one. And maybe that's why God allowed George Müller stories to be recorded, not just to inspire, but to remind every generation that the God who provided then still provides now. If he could send flour to a hungry widow, if he could heal lungs that refuse to breathe, if he could multiply donations for orphans, and if he could drop a coin into a parasol for a woman in distress, then he can reach into your life too, right where you are. You might not see how, you might not know when, but is already arranging it, quietly, faithfully, lovingly. So, the next time life feels tight, the next time your 5 cents seems missing, pause, pray, and trust that God has a way of slipping provision into the very places you least expect it. He may not always give you what you want, but He'll always give you what you need. Because that's who He is, the Father who never forgets His children. And if you let this truth sink deep, you'll realize something profound. Faith isn't just believing for miracles. It's recognizing that you yourself are living inside one. It's so amazing, isn't it? How these real-life stories bring something alive in our hearts again, that tender awareness that God is not far away, He's near. You can almost feel the invisible thread connecting these people. The widow praying in her dimly lit kitchen, the sick man whispering for strength, the mother kneeling beside a child's bed, and all their prayers rising together like incense before the same Father who hears them all. And I can just imagine the editor of that paper, reading letter after letter that came in from every corner of the country, eyes wide with awe, maybe even tears brimming sometimes, because each testimony wasn't just a report, it was a heartbeat. One after another, they came, stories of deliverance, unexpected provision, quiet strength in grief, and answers that could only be explained by divine intervention. There was one from a man who had lost everything in a fire, his home, his savings, even his hope. He wrote that one night, sitting amid the ashes, he prayed not for money or a miracle, but for courage to start again. And the very next morning, a neighbor he barely knew came by, saying she had been moved to offer him a small workshop job. That one small opportunity became the start of a whole new chapter in his life. It wasn't the job, he wrote. It was the assurance that God hadn't forgotten me. And that line, that quiet confession, captures the essence of so many prayers we whisper today. Because beneath our words, beneath the Lord, please help me, or Father, open this door, what we are really saying is, Lord, please don't forget me. Please still see me. And every time, God's answer comes wrapped in His presence before His provision. He reminds us first that we are not alone, then He begins to move. Another woman wrote to say, she had prayed for her husband's conversion for 12 long years, 12 years of church alone, 12 years of tearful nights, 12 years of asking and not seeing. But she said something that caught my heart, even when he refused to hear my words. God was hearing my prayers. And one night, she came home to find her husband sitting quietly in the corner, a Bible open in his hands. When she asked what happened, he said, I can't explain it. I just know I need Jesus. That's prayer, not logic, not timing. Just the unseen hand of grace working behind the curtains of a hardened heart until light seeps through. Sometimes the hardest part about prayer isn't the praying, it's the waiting. It's that in-between space where nothing seems to move. When the bank balance stays low, the sickness lingers, the doors stay closed. It's in that gap that faith is tested most. But you see, waiting time isn't wasted time. It's the soil where deep trust grows. It's where we learn that prayer isn't just about getting answers, it's about getting anchored. Anchored in the truth that God is still who He says He is, even when the outcome isn't clear. Many of the testimonies published in that weekly weren't just about what God did, but about what God became to the people who prayed. One wrote, before, I prayed because I was afraid. Now I pray because I am at peace. Another said, I used to see prayer as my last resort. Now it's my first. These were the quiet revolutions happening in hearts across the world, people rediscovering the sacred intimacy of talking with God as a father, not as a distant power. You see, when George Müller prayed for the orphans under his care, he wasn't just performing a religious act. He was having a conversation with someone real. There's something profoundly childlike about that kind of faith, the kind that believes the Father's Heart bends close when his children speak. Müller himself once said that prayer is not overcoming God's reluctance, but laying hold of his willingness. Isn't that beautiful? And that's exactly what these testimonies proved. They were echoes of the same truth. God wants to answer. God longs to be trusted. The problem is never his silence. Often, it's our distance. We pray, but sometimes we don't expect. We ask, but deep down, we already assume the answer is no. But what if faith means asking again anyway? What if faith means showing up before the throne one more time, even when yesterday's answer was wait? I think of Jesus, parable of the persistent widow, how she kept coming to the unjust judge, refusing to give up. And Jesus said, "Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night?" Luke 18 verse 7. That wasn't just a story about persistence. It was about perspective, about knowing that we are not pleading to an indifferent judge but speaking to a loving Father. Churches would read them aloud during gatherings. Families would cut out the stories and paste them into journals. Children would memorize them as proof that God cared about their small prayers too. One testimony told of a young girl who had lost her father. Her mother could no longer pay for her school fees, and the teacher told her she might have to stop attending. The little girl went home, knelt by her bedside, and said, "Dear Lord, you said you would be a father to the fatherless. I need you to take care of me now." The next morning, the school principal called her in and said her tuition had been paid anonymously for the rest of the year. When I read that, I couldn't help but pause, because it reminded me of what Jesus said in Matthew 6. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. That's the beauty of prayer. It's not about informing God of what he doesn't know. It's about involving him in what we are going through. These stories were like living parables, reminders that God is still active in everyday life. They weren't about grand miracles like parting seas or raising the dead. They were about little acts of faithfulness, a rent paid, a letter arriving just in time, a heart softened, a tear turned into trust. It's interesting that as these reports spread, people from all walks of life began to write in. Farmers, seamstresses, soldiers, widows, even businessmen, all with different needs, but all telling the same truth. When they turned to God sincerely, help came in ways they couldn't have imagined. Some even said that the answers came after they had stopped striving, when they finally let go and said, "Lord, your will be done." There's something powerful in that surrender, because when prayer shifts from "Lord, give me what I want" to "Lord, do what's best," we position ourselves to receive the deepest kind of answer, peace. And that peace isn't dependent on whether the situation changes. It comes from knowing we have changed in the process. One old sailor wrote that he had survived a terrible storm at sea after crying out to God for the first time in decades. He said, "When I reached land, I realized it wasn't the storm that frightened me most. It was the emptiness I had carried for years without prayer." That confession captures the heart of it all, because what's worse than any storm is living without the anchor of faith. Even those who had once mocked the idea of prayer began to soften. One skeptic, who had written essays against religious delusion, later confessed that reading these testimonies broke something inside him. He said, "I could argue with doctrines, but not with tears." And every story carried tears that felt too sincere to be invented. He later became one of the strongest advocates for prayer in his community. What's incredible is that these weren't isolated miracles. They were waves of grace, washing over an entire generation. People began to realize that prayer wasn't confined to churches or clergy. It was the right and privilege of every soul. The sick woman in her room, the farmer in his field, the child by his bedside, all could reach heaven and be heard. And that's still true today. You don't need fancy words, a perfect past, or even great faith. You just need honesty. God listens to sincerity more than eloquence. Sometimes all you can say is, "Lord, help me." And he does. You know, George Müller's life was a living demonstration of that truth. When he needed to feed hundreds of orphans with no money in hand, he didn't panic. He prayed. And somehow, someone would knock on the door with bread. milk, or provisions every time. His journals recorded thousands of such instances. Not coincidences, confirmations. And that's the heart of these testimonies too. They weren't stories of luck. They were chronicles of trust. Proof that even when the world seems indifferent, heaven is attentive. So maybe right now, as you're listening, you're in a situation where the answers haven't come yet. Maybe you've prayed and waited and nothing's changed. Let me tell you, keep holding on. God is never late. He's never distracted. And He never wastes a waiting season. There will come a day, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, when you'll look back and say, that's why it took that long. That's why He said no to that prayer, because He was saying yes to something better. That's the thread running through all these stories. God not only answers, He answers wisely. You know, as I sit with these stories, real accounts of people who trusted God when everything else had failed, I can't help but feel like we are looking into a mirror. Because, truly, nothing much has changed. The setting might be different. The clothes, the language, the times, but the human heart? It's the same. The need for help, the hunger for hope, the ache for provision, the longing for peace, those are timeless. And what's even more beautiful is that the same God who heard those 19th century cries in England and America is still hearing ours today. Prayer didn't expire with George Müller's generation. The power that moved then still moves now. These testimonies remind me that every answered prayer, no matter how small, is like a ripple on a calm lake. It keeps spreading. One person's faith stirs another's. One miracle inspires 10 more. And soon an entire community begins to believe again. Think about it. When the Illustrated Christian Weekly published those stories, people didn't just read them for entertainment. They clung to them like lifelines. For some, it was the first time they dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, God would listen to them too. I imagine an old widow, sitting by candlelight, reading one of those testimonies aloud to her children, her voice trembling, her heart pounding, and something stirring deep inside her, that quiet whisper saying, if He did it for them, He can do it for us. That's the contagious power of real faith stories. They move from page to heart, from heart to mouth, and from mouth to prayer. And before you know it, revival begins, not the loud, emotional kind that lasts a weekend, but the steady, enduring revival that reshapes how people see God forever. I think about how prayer changed whole families back then. One testimony told of a man who was known in his town for his drinking and violent temper. His wife had prayed for years, often late into the night, when everyone else had given up hope. She said there were nights she could almost hear the devil mocking her. You're wasting your time. He'll never change. But she kept praying anyway. And then one night, her husband came home, sat quietly, and said, I don't know what's happening to me, but I can't shake the thought that God's been calling me. That night, he broke down in tears, gave his life to Christ, and never touched a bottle again. That woman later wrote, I learned that prayer does not always change things immediately, but it changes hearts, and that changes everything. Isn't that powerful? Prayer doesn't always change our circumstances first. It changes us until we are strong enough to walk through the circumstance with grace. That's something George Müller understood deeply. When he prayed for daily provision for hundreds of orphans, it wasn't just about the bread or milk. It was about trusting God enough to keep doing what was right, even when nothing visible confirmed that it would work out. And I think that's a message someone needs right now, to keep doing what's right, even when the results haven't shown up yet. Don't stop giving, don't stop serving, don't stop praying. God may be writing your testimony in this very waiting period. In those old testimonies, some prayers were answered instantly, a bill paid, a sick child healed, a door suddenly opened. But many others were long, painful, and full of uncertainty. Yet every single one of them, in hindsight, showed God's perfect timing. You see, prayer is not a transaction, it's a relationship. It's not I ask, you give. It's I come. You hear, you lead. And sometimes, His leading takes us through valleys so we can learn to depend on Him in ways we never would have in comfort. One letter from a woman in Boston. Describe how she lost her job and didn't know how she would pay rent. She said she prayed for help every day, and for weeks nothing happened. She grew anxious, even angry. Then, one morning, while walking down a street she didn't usually take, she met an old friend who asked casually, "Are you still working with that printing company?" She replied no, and the friend said, "Perfect. My cousin just opened a publishing house and needs a proofreader. Go see him today." She got the job the same day and later wrote, "God did not forget me. He was just arranging a better path." Isn't that exactly how He works? Quietly, precisely, lovingly. Sometimes we think silence means absence, but more often it means preparation. You might not see the thread right now, but He's weaving it. You might think your prayers are falling flat, but they're building something behind the scenes. Heaven is never idle when faith is alive. There's something else I love about these stories, how honest they are. None of the writers claimed to be perfect. They didn't say, "We prayed because we were holy." They said, "We prayed because we were desperate." And I think that's one of the most freeing truths we could ever embrace. Desperation doesn't disqualify you from prayer. It qualifies you for it. God loves when we come to Him honestly. No pretending. No trying to impress. Just open hands and open heart saying, "Lord, help me." That's when heaven leans close. I remember a quote from Müller himself that fits perfectly here. The beginning of anxiety is the end of faith, and the beginning of true faith is the end of anxiety. He wasn't saying we'd never feel fear. He was saying faith gives fear no power to rule us. That's what these testimonies taught countless readers, that prayer isn't wishful thinking. It's active trust. It's choosing to lean into the character of God when the outcome is still unclear. And maybe that's what this generation needs to rediscover. With all our technology, speed, and self-reliance, we've almost forgotten what it means to wait on God. But the people in those stories, they waited. And in the waiting, they grew. Their faith wasn't fragile. It was forged in the fire of need. Let me tell you, a faith that's been tested is a faith that can be trusted. And that's what I believe these old pages were meant to show us. That the God of George Müller, the God of the widows, the God of the forgotten, He hasn't changed. The same faith that carried them through can carry us now. Hey friends, as we continue, I want you to pause and let this sink in. Prayer didn't just change people's private lives in George Müller's time. It began shaping whole communities. Many people who once mocked faith began to notice something unusual. They saw widows whose tables were never empty even when they had no income. They saw orphans who never begged, yet never lacked. They saw people lose their jobs and somehow still remain at peace, only to find something better days later. These were not coincidences. They were quiet revolutions of grace happening one answered prayer at a time. There's a particular letter that always moves me. It came from a small town where a local pastor decided to keep a public prayer journal. He would write down requests from townspeople every week and then report back any answers that came. At first, people mocked him. But over the months, things began to happen. Debts were cleared. Families reconciled. Sick children healed. Crops that had been failing suddenly began to flourish again. The town newspaper even wrote, "Whether by faith or by providence, the people who pray seem to prosper in ways that defy mere logic." And that's what Müller's entire ministry kept proving. Faith may not make sense, but it works. Think about the world we live in today, how quick people are to trust systems, strategies, or human networks, yet how slow to simply pray. The early believers that George Müller inspired lived differently. They didn't see prayer as the last resort. They saw it as the first response. Now, one of the things that made these testimonies so powerful was how ordinary the people were. Yet they discovered that prayer made them powerful in ways the world couldn't measure. One woman wrote, "Prayer has been my refuge when my cupboard was empty, my doctor when my body was weak, my comforter when my friends were gone, and my light when the night was dark. It has never failed me yet." Another wrote, "When I prayed for food, the door knocked. When I prayed for peace, the storm inside me grew calm. When I prayed for forgiveness, I found myself forgiving others. I have learned that prayer not only changes things, it changes me." These aren't mere stories. They're evidence that heaven listens. And I believe that's the legacy George Müller wanted to leave behind. Not just his orphan houses, but his proof that God is still near, still involved, still faithful. He often said, "The great point is to bring people to see that God is still the living God, and that He still hears prayer as in days of old." If we truly grasp that, we would worry less and worship more. We'd replace panic with prayer and fear with faith. Imagine how different our world would be if prayer once again became a normal part of our public life, not just something whispered in crisis, but something woven into our culture. That's how revival starts, not always with crowds and noise, but with hearts that rediscover how to trust God again. So, dear friend, maybe this is your moment to start a testimony of your own. Maybe you've prayed and seen nothing yet. Don't stop. Maybe you've been mocked for believing. Stand firm. The same God who answered those letters in the Illustrated Christian Weekly, who provided for George Müller's orphans, and who turned countless impossible situations around, is still writing new stories today. Yours could be next. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things, which thou knowest not. Jeremiah 33 verse 3.